Hey everyone, welcome to your weekly current events and election update from the AP Gov team. It is Monday night, October the 21st, and we've got some updates on what's happening in the world and in our country, as well as what's going on in the 2020 election. So let's get started. So what are we going to cover tonight? Well, remember, as always on Monday nights, it's going to be myself and my co-streamer Fatima, who's also on here, and she'll pick up the last half. I'm going to cover the current events, and she's going to cover the election updates. So first, we'll start on what's going on with the impeachment process and the latest updates around that. If you don't know what's happening with the impeachment at all, I'd encourage you to go back and look at our last 2 weeks, or 3 weeks, I guess now, of streams on that, because you will find lots of good background information on the impeachment process and all of that background. We're going to talk a little bit about Mitt Romney and his Twitter, because you may have seen something in the news about that today. And then the last current event update we'll talk about is what the latest is on Syria after the president decided to pull us out earlier last week. And then from there, Fatima's going to pick up with the 2020 Senate elections. She's going to be talking about Tulsi Gabbard, one of our Democratic primary candidates, and the Russians, and then election interference, a word that you're going to see lots this year. Okay, so here we go. So let's talk about what's going on in the world of impeachment. So initially, the House Democrats had really hoped that they would wrap up the whole impeachment committee process on Donald Trump by Thanksgiving. Now, it's looking now like that's not going to happen. And when I say wrap up the impeachment process, I don't want you to get confused here. I'm not talking about the whole process in terms of the House impeaching if they do impeach, and then the Senate trying. Definitely the Senate trying would not happen by Thanksgiving. But the Democrats had hoped that by Thanksgiving they could have a vote on the House floor of impeachment, meaning all the committees have done hearing all the different testimonies and have made their recommendations. However, what they basically discovered here in the last week is that every time they call another witness to their investigative hearings, more and more leads come up. More and more people are coming out and saying, like, hey, I'd like to testify too. I'll give you a really good example. Both the president and Secretary of State Pompeo forbade the State Department employees utilizing executive privilege, which if you don't understand that, we talked about that a couple weeks ago in a current event update. You can go back and check that out. Actually, the very first current event update. And anyways, using executive privilege, both the president and Secretary of State Pompeo has told the employees at the State Department, no, don't go and testify. However, there are a handful of employees who've decided, yeah, we're going to testify anyways. We don't care what you say. And so there are all sorts of people from the State Department that want to testify now. There are other people that are connected to the initial whistleblower case that want to testify now. Basically, what you're starting to see here are people who have stayed silent for some time and have now decided that now's the time to come out and share whatever it is that they want to share. And so basically, the committee in the House that's handling a lot of these interviews for the impeachment process have said there's just no way. Adam Schiff, who's the chairman of that committee, has basically told Speaker Pelosi, there's just no way that we're probably going to get to a place where we can make a recommendation to the House and have a vote by Thanksgiving. So then how long will it be? Well, he's saying basically most Democrats in the House think that, barring nothing crazy happens between now and then, which the way politics works, you never know, that sometime between Thanksgiving and Christmas, the House should be able to finish their process, and then it would move over to the Senate, and then the Senate would enact. I don't think you'll see on the Senate side anything before Christmas. If the House decides to vote, then you'll probably see it before Christmas. It's kind of a crappy time of year to really do, the impeachment process, but I don't think they really have a choice, because the other thing that House Democrats are very aware of is they want to try to get it outside of the election season, which the primary season is going to start the very first week of January with the Iowa caucuses. And so they want to keep this process, which will definitely be political and definitely be messy, out of that time frame. And so they're definitely going to try to get it done before then. Also, another big thing with the impeachment process this week Mick Mulvaney, who you see there, who is President Trump's chief of staff. I want to say he is the president's third or fourth chief of staff since he came to office. The other day, he gave a press conference at the White House, and many things could be described as more successful than that press conference. One of them being the meteorite that wiped out all the dinosaurs in America. That was more successful than Mick Mulvaney's press conference. And if you don't believe me, I'd encourage you to go check out a YouTube video of it. Even Republicans are basically saying he messed up because he really didn't think about what he was saying before he said it. And he said some things that he probably shouldn't have said. So he made really two startling decisions. First, that the U.S. Military aid to Ukraine had been contingent on an investigation into this debunked conspiracy theory now around Joe Biden. Okay, so basically he's admitting that Donald Trump did do this kind of quid pro quo thing, saying, Ukraine, you don't get your money unless you do this investigation. So he admitted that in a press conference. And then he talked about the interference in the 2016 election and thought that politics was influencing his boss on foreign policy. None of those things are things that you probably should have said, okay? At least not on national television in front of all these press folks. And needless to say, Mick Mulvaney, instead of just not appearing on television, then went on Fox, a Fox show on Sunday and tried to walk some of this back. But then when he tried to walk some of it back, he ended up actually making it worse and saying a couple other things. One of the things that he said is, I've got news for everybody. Get over it, he advised. They're going to be political influences on foreign policy. Elections have consequences, and foreign policy is going to change from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. In related news to that, President Trump on his election website are now selling T-shirts that don't say "Make America Great Again," but now say "Get Over It" as a result of the Mulvaney quote. So if you want a shirt that says hashtag Get Over It, you know where you can buy it from and support the president if you are a supporter of the president for his campaign election. Folks, I can't make this stuff up. This is our current politics. Okay? Moving on. Okay, let's talk about Mitt Romney. So Mitt Romney and Twitter. Well, if you don't know who Mitt Romney is, some quick background. Mitt Romney was the 2012 Republican nominee who ran against not Donald Trump. Lord, I got Donald Trump on the mind. Who ran against Barack Obama when Barack Obama was running for his second term of office. Now, obviously, he lost. He is former governor of Utah. He is also now the senator from Utah. So he's a member of the United States Senate. And so it basically came to light this actually yesterday or the day before that Romney has a secret Twitter account. And he kind of blurted out in an interview, or he let loose in an interview, that he has a secret account to keep tabs on what he called the political conversation. Now, he would not in that interview say what his Twitter handle was for the secret account that he had. Now, why he even admitted to it is beyond me. I probably would not have admitted that. But hey, whatever floats your boat. So, of course, journalists did what they do well. And they investigated it, and they discovered that his handle was Pierre Delecto. Now, if you're getting really excited right now and you're trying to find him on Twitter, you won't, because the account's been now made private. So you can't not see this account. Now, what's the history behind the name? You got me. But there's a bit more to that, too, okay? Think about this. The 2012 Republican presidential nominee and a sitting U.S. senator made this because he felt the need to defend his commitment to his party from behind the veneer of a fake person's account on Twitter. Mitt Romney is a pretty vocal critic of the president. President Trump has gone on the attack on him on Twitter as recently as this week, as well as the president's son-in-law. He doesn't really have a lot of good things to say about Mitt Romney. I would say Mitt Romney is probably a moderate Republican, and he is not afraid to speak out against the president, which obviously does not go over very well with the current president. And so, excuse me, he hasn't come out and directly said that he would support impeachment, but he also hasn't said that he wouldn't support impeachment yet. So yeah, Mitt Romney's got a fake Twitter, well, not a fake Twitter account, like a ghost Twitter account, which he's using to kind of keep track of things. So fun stuff. And then the last thing I'll talk about on my end tonight is what's going on in Syria. So, as you'll recall last week in the weekly update, we talked about the president making the decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. And if you don't really know a lot about what's happening in Syria, I'm going to give you like the 10-second version here, but you might want to go back and take a look at that. So basically, Syria, which is just north of Israel in the Middle East, has been going through a civil war now for years, probably almost 10 years. And the government, under their president, has been carrying out, which some might classify as a genocide, others just might classify as mass murder, of the Syrian rebels, who are basically pushing for democratic reform. And as a result, there's been a mass exodus of Syrians from Syria who've tried to escape and have gone to places like Europe, and they were coming to the United States until President Trump put a ban on immigrants from Syria just not that long after becoming president. But they have poured into places like Turkey and walked into places in Europe and even got themselves on rafts and things. Many people have died in that journey, let alone. So over 100,000 people have fled their homes just in the past week in Syria, because when President Trump made the decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria, which understand we had a pretty small contingent there in the first place, Turkey launched a military offensive against the Kurdish people that are in northern Syria this week. And most pundits said that that's exactly what was going to happen. The Turkish do not like the Kurds for a reason I'll get into here in just a second. Even the Republicans in Congress, including some of President Trump's biggest supporters, like Senator Lindsey Graham, all have told the president this is not a good idea and have met with him this week to say, you should never have pulled out of Syria. Turkey's president, Mr. Erdogan, wants to create what he called a safe zone along Turkey's border with Syria. Basically, their plan is to resettle up to 2 million of the 3.6 million Syrian refugees that are currently living in their area. They basically want the Syrian problem out of their area. But that's what they say on paper, but they also would like to pulverize the Kurds. And that's really what's happening here. So on Thursday, Vice President Mike Pence and Turkish President Erdogan made a deal whereby Ankara, which is the capital of Turkey, agreed to a 5-day ceasefire, during which time fighters for the YPG, which is the Kurdish group, that had helped the United States fight ISIS for years, would withdraw from this 20-mile safe zone near the Turkish border. So we knew, even though the Kurdish people have been helping the United States for the last 10 years, trying to defeat ISIS in Syria and in Iraq and all these places, we knew that when we pulled out and the Turkish moved in, that the Turkish were going to try to wipe them out. But they still did that, and that's why a lot of people are upset with the president, including senators. So even though the ceasefire was put into place just on last Thursday, Turkey hasn't been holding up its side of the deal, and really the ceasefire is not working. So what's the deal with Turkey and the Kurds? Well, there's a long-standing conflict between the Turkish state and the Kurds who live in Turkey, who constitute about 15 to 20% of the population. In response to uprisings in the 1920s and 1930s, many Kurds were resettled out of Turkey. And Kurdish names and costumes were banned, the use of Kurdish language was restricted, and even the existence of Kurdish ethnic identity was denied, and people were instead identified as Mountain Turks. So basically, the Turkish people did not like the Kurds from almost 100 years ago. In 1978, a political organization called the PKK was formed, also known as the Kurdistan Workers' Party. And they called for an independent Kurdish state within Turkey. So basically, they wanted to chop off a piece of land from Turkey and make it their own. 6 years later, they began an armed struggle for their independence. And an estimated 40,000 people have been killed and hundreds of thousands have been displaced. So the Kurds have been displaced in places all over the Middle East. Northern Iraq is one place, into Syria is another place. And so there's this long-standing issue between the Turkish people and the Kurds. So I just saw, Ashley, I just saw your question on why are they killing everybody. I didn't see when you posted that, so I'm not sure who you're referring to. So if you can clarify that, you can let me know. And then, Ryder, your question about the Turks and Kurds, many wars during the medieval times. I don't know that I would classify what was going on in the medieval times as issues between the Kurds and the Turks. There certainly were clashes between Turkish groups like the Seljuk Turks and the Mamluks. And some of the Islamic empires in the Middle East, like the Abbasid, and even down as to far down as to South Asia, like India, the Indian subcontinent. But I wouldn't classify the Kurds as part of that group. So moving on here, I'm going to pass it over to Fatima now. Just give me 1 second here to push her on the screen, and she is going to talk about the latest info that is going on in the election. So she should be coming up now. Sometimes this can get wonky, so bear with me. She's coming on now.
Okay, hey guys. So in the past few weeks, we've been talking a lot about like the 2020 election in terms of like the presidential race, but now we're going to spend a little bit of time on what's been happening in terms of Senate races, right? Because there's not just a presidential election happening, there's also like a lot of other races, like the House races and the Senate ones. So let's like look first into what's been happening with the 2020 Senate elections. And so the first thing that we need to understand is the fact that Republicans have 53 seats in the Senate right now. So that means that they have a majority. And so even though Democrats were able to gain back the House in the 2018 elections, Republicans were able to hold on to the Senate. But the thing that's different in 2020 is the fact that there's 23 Republican seats that are going to be up for election and only 12 Democratic seats that are going up. And the reason why that's super important is because of the fact that there's way more GOP seats that have to be defended. And so Democrats will be able to like spend more resources in like challenging them rather than like the Republicans who will have to like spread their resources at the national level like more sparsely. And so one thing that's going to be looked at is the fact that Trump and his approval rating have been like pretty like steadily like it's been pretty stable at like 40-ish%, but that's a very low approval rating for president, right? And so some people are like thinking that it's going to hurt some Republicans' reelection bids. And especially when we're seeing like most recently with the impeachment, like Robbie talked about earlier, that's something that could really hurt Republicans when they're going into an election year. And so one of the reasons is because a lot of people just like vote straight tickets. So if they vote like for one Republican, they're just going to vote Republican all the way down, and they're not even going to really pay attention to like who the Democrats are. And like same with like people who tend to vote Democrat, like they might just vote for every single Democrat on the ticket and not even bother to look at who the Republicans running are. So when we see at the national level, if Trump's approval rating is getting like lower and it's being hurt, then Republicans could like suffer the effects of that too. And so Democrats are focusing on like 3 main seats. So that's Martha McSally's seat in Arizona, Susan Collins' seat in Maine, Cory Gardner's seat in Colorado, and Doug Jones, who's the guy who's smiling in the picture right there. He's a Democrat from Alabama. And so his seat was flipped blue in a special election, but it was flipped blue because there was a very like big scandal that came out regarding like the Republican that he was running against. And it was like becoming very clear that he had some like sexual misconduct. So because that seat is still in a red state, it's still considered to be something that the Democrats could lose. So they're also trying to hold on to that seat in Alabama. And so in terms of the Senate elections, that's the like overall stuff that's been happening. But in terms of election news, when we look towards Tulsi Gabbard, who we're going to talk about next, she's also been in the news lately when it comes to her relationship with Russia. And so if you guys remember in the 2016 elections, Hillary Clinton was the Democratic presidential nominee. And so even though she's not running for the nomination in 2020, she recently said that one of the female 2020 candidates was a favorite of the Russians. And so even though she didn't specifically say who that person was, it was pretty clear that she was referring to Tulsi Gabbard. And so there are 5 women that are running for the nomination. And so that's Tulsi Gabbard, Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Kamala Harris, and Marianne Williamson. And so the only person out of these 5 women that's had a very positive relationship with Russia is Tulsi Gabbard. And so she's the senator from Hawaii, and she served in the military. And so what Hillary Clinton has been alluding to in her comments is that her campaign is being aided by Russian propaganda. And so that's what Hillary Clinton is referring to. And so if you see news about Tulsi Gabbard, that's probably what you've been seeing. And so on top of that, we can see that Tulsi Gabbard has responded to what she's been saying. And so that's going to be in the next slide. But yeah, so when we see the fact that Gabbard and her relationship with Russia is something that's been really positive. And so she's been mentioned very often in the Russian news. And so there's also this website called 4chan. And so a lot of right-wing groups are active on it. And so she's also been mentioned there frequently. And so as a member of Congress, she also met with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And so we've been talking about Syria, as Robbie mentioned earlier. And so some background is the fact that Russia and Syria have been working together to make sure that the Syrian president can stay in power. And so she also went on to criticize a US strike against the Syrian government. And so, and when we look at the Syrian conflict, Russia is supporting the government within Syria, and the United States is not doing that. And so when we look at the fact that she's meeting with the president of Syria and talking about him and trying to stop that from happening, it's just something that's kind of weird for a presidential candidate to be doing. And so because of the comments, she threatened to boycott the 4th Democratic debate, which was in October, and it happened in on the 15th. And so she accused the Democratic National Committee and corporate media of rigging the election. So she's pretty much trying to say that all of these people are working against her to make sure she doesn't get the nomination. And so something interesting is that Senator Bernie Sanders called the accusation outrageous. And so something important to remember there is that she was one of the only people who endorsed him in 2016. So Tulsi Gabbard and the Russians isn't just some really bad band that you've never heard of. It's just this interaction between Tulsi Gabbard, who is one of the people running for the Democratic nomination, and the Russian government that has been trying to interfere within the American election. And so we're going to actually talk about that election interference now. And so Facebook recently came out and said that some people that are linked to the Internet Research Agency are laying the groundwork to interfere in the 2020 election. And so the Internet Research Agency is a Kremlin-backed troll group. And so the United States literally indicted it for interference in the 2016 presidential election. And so that's something that's super important, because when we think about election interference and election hacking, a lot of times people would just think of the little graphic there where the Russians might be hacking into the polls and changing votes. And so it's actually a much broader effort. A lot of times what we're seeing is Russian trolls are going on social media and posting these memes on Facebook and stuff like that in order to spread misinformation. And so these profiles that have originated in Russia have been building this network of accounts on Instagram, which is also owned by Facebook. And so they're pretty much trying to look like groups in swing states. So pretty important states where the election could change from one Democrat to a Republican is where they've been trying to focus their efforts. So that's really what's been happening in terms of election interference. And that's why Facebook has been talking about it. And so a little bit more on that is the fact that when we look at specifically Facebook and how they've been creating these profiles, the way that election interference has been working is a little bit more in detail when we look at the next slide. And so what the Russians have been doing pretty much is they're posing as Americans from all sides of the political spectrum. So they're not just like focusing on pretending to be like left-wing trolls or like right-wing trolls. They're pretty much like covering it all. And so one of the anomalies was a lot of them were like opposed to VP Joe Biden. And so he's obviously running for the Democratic nomination, and he's like very much considered to be the front runner by a lot of people. And so it's pretty clear why they're targeting him, because he seems to be the person that's most likely to win the nomination. And so in 2016, these Russian trolls pretty much used the exact same strategy. So from the right, they criticized Hillary Clinton and said that she was like a horrible person and a criminal, right? And so that was done in order to like mobilize Republican turnout and make sure that like Republicans turned out to vote for Donald Trump. And so on the left, they did the exact opposite and said that like Clinton wasn't liberal enough. And so she wasn't like a good enough person to like vote for. And so there was like literally no point of doing it. And so especially they like tried to focus on making sure that people who were like more liberal than Hillary Clinton, because she was like considered to be a moderate compared to Bernie Sanders, and African Americans wouldn't actually turn out to vote. And so that was an effort that like was pretty effective in decreasing Democratic turnout. And so yeah, it's important to remember that election interference isn't just like hacking into polls and stuff. It's also spreading misinformation and like causing a political environment and discourse that's way more toxic and causes people to like not actually look at factual information and instead turn to like what fuels their like opinions and look at that as fact. So that's all we have today.